All right, so today I'm going to present to you the modern and medieval languages course in Cambridge, and also its adjacent tri-courses, which Alex has mentioned. So linguistics with modern and medieval languages, and modern and medieval languages with history. And I'm really going to focus on modern languages because simply this is what I do. As I'm sure you can tell from my accent, I'm French, and what I teach in Cambridge is French literature. So what I'm going to try to do is to give you a sense of the kind of stuff you'll be learning here, and then give you a sample lecture of so that you get an idea. So I'm going to share my kind of PowerPoint, and hopefully that's going to be legible and manageable. This is not the first image. Okay. Here we are. Modern Languages, Taster Lecture 2026, Olivier Tonneau, that's me. So here's a very, very simple breaking down of the things that you learn when you take modern and medieval languages. So obviously you learn languages. So that means that you learn the grammar, the syntax, the vocabulary, and so on and so forth. And in order to apply this knowledge, you practice translation. So first you practice translation into your home language, because that's the easier version. And then later on, you will translate into the languages that you're learning. So that's a bit tougher and also quite interesting. Obviously, there is a lot of time for conversation. And even if you only do modern and medieval languages and not linguistics as half with your tripos, you still can take some bits of linguistics within the tripos if you want to familiarize yourself with it. It's very interesting, although I'm saying this and I wouldn't really know because I've never done linguistics, but it's a more scientific approach to language. And then you do literature, and that is, I think, of course, very interesting. This is what I prefer. And it's not really literature in a narrow sense, because there are also some films and some philosophy, things like this. And as you study the literature, of course, you study the history within which the texts that you study are embedded. So that's pretty exciting. And as you study the history, you study the society. And obviously, if you study a society, say France in the 18th century, which of course contains the French Revolution, more on that in a very short moment, of course you would necessarily get into the politics. So there is a lot of politics in this talk. For instance, a lot of also colonial history and things like this. So it's a very, very broad, rich, and I think very interesting course. I see that there's something in the chat, so let me just check. So now, in this presentation, what I'm going to try to show you is precisely how literature, society, history, politics, and even translation, they come together, and how they all form some a kind of work that you would be doing if you study here. And I took as the subject of this talk one of the world's most famous songs, which is La Marseillaise. So this is the French national hymn. But because it was written during the French Revolution and it is associated with the revolution, and because the French Revolution, of course, resonated worldwide, and then the song itself is very famous. And I will attempt to sing the chorus for you. So it is the lines at the very bottom of the score. Marchons, marchons, qu'un sang impur abreuve nos sillons. All right. So I didn't sing this just to show off my superb baritone. I sang this because this line is very famous for its very shocking content. This line says, so qu'un on your left in the French, qu'un sang impur abreuve nos sillons, which means may an impure blood water our furrows. Now this is pretty gruesome, and also maybe your intuitive response to it would be that it seems pretty racist, this notion that some blood may be pure and other bloods may be impure. And given that the song was written in the context of the French Revolutionary Wars, so when France was at war with the Spaniards, the English, the Prussians, the Austrians, a lot of people are saying, whoa, this is disgusting. We shouldn't have this line in our national hymn. And indeed, there are countless debates. So here you see this is the front page of a daily called Le Parisien. So, grand débat, great debate. And what if we changed the words of La Marseillaise? And, well, obviously, if I thought that it was a horrible, racist, gruesome song, I would tend to agree. But however, as I will try to show you, the intuitive response to the song is actually potentially very misleading. And in order to show you this, to explain this to you, I need to refresh your memories about the French Revolution, or maybe simply introduce you very succinctly to the French Revolution if you've never had a chance to study. Now, before the French Revolution, and ever since the Middle Ages, French society, and this applied also to English societies and to almost all European societies, was divided in three groups. So you had the nobility, la noblesse, the clergy underneath in dark blue, so that's of course the church, and the ones in red are all the rest, the third estate. This is very interesting. So in the Middle Ages, there was this tripartition of society between those who prayed, so that's the church, and their mission was to ensure the salvation of society. Those who fought, and that was the nobility, and their mission was to guarantee the safety of society, and those who toiled, and their mission was to feed society. And ever since the Middle Ages, when there was a social crisis in France, then the king would gather representatives of these three orders, they were called, so representatives of the nobility, the clergy, and the third estate. And they would discuss the issues, and then they would vote on the issues. And the nobility and the clergy both had a voice. The third estate also had a voice. So obviously that means that as soon as the nobility and the clergy agreed, they were sure to outvote the third estate. Even though the third estate constituted, say, 90% of the population, that's even a conservative estimate. So you imagine that all this was not very fair and not very democratic. Now, when the French Revolution started, it was because of a public debt crisis, and the king gathered the Estates General. But at some stage, the people in the third estate said, we've had enough of this tripartition of society into three distinct groups. We want everybody to merge, and everybody votes for themselves, and that's just it. So we vote by head, like by person, not by order. And obviously, the moment this was implemented, then that meant that if the third estate voted altogether, they only needed to gather a few votes from the two other orders, and they would be majority. The king was furious, the nobility was furious, the clergy was furious, but the third estate stuck to its gun, and that was, in effect, what started the French Revolution. And so this is a very famous painting of the moment when the representatives of the third estate are taking what is called the tennis court oath, because they gathered on the tennis court of all places, and they're swearing that they will never leave until they are acknowledged as the National Assembly. So no more General Estates General, but one National Assembly. Okay, so this was then the revolution put an end to this hierarchized representation of society. It did many more things. It stripped the nobility of its privileges, and therefore the nobility was not very happy, and they started leaving. A lot of them left for the UK. Well, there was no, was there already a UK? Well, for England, others went to Prussia, to Russia, wherever. And so this is a picture of them, you see, like getting on a boat and moving to other lands. The interesting thing is that they did not just leave to, say, save their heads. They left to prepare a reinvasion of France. Because, of course, you know that at the time, all the other surrounding European countries were monarchies, and all the kings and queens of Europe were pretty much like cousins and brothers and so on. So the expectation was that they would go to the neighboring countries, and the kings and queens of these neighboring countries would raise armies, and the émigrés, they were called, the emigrated, will return to France, crush the revolution, and get things over. It is in this context that the Marseillaise was invented. And now, if you think that this is the context in which the Marseillaise was invented, you realize that the Marseillaise was sung by people who were commoners and who were marching off to war to defend the revolution against noble people. Now, this is a little bit weird, right? Because obviously the nobility, they define themselves as being of pure blood. So when you're a commoner and you're marching to fight against noblemen, why would you say that you want to drench the furrows with impure blood when you know that you're marching against people who are claiming that their blood is pure? Well, here's the hypothesis. The impure blood, of course, is the blood of the commoners. And when they're singing this song, they're not saying we're going to pour the blood of our opponents. They're saying that we will give their own impure blood for the salvation of the revolution. And they are taking pride in their so-called impurity. In doing this, they are doing a rhetorical move that is well established and that is called the inversion of the stigmata. I've given you an example of this from Aimé Césaire because it's very famous. So now we're jumping a couple of centuries towards the present. So Aimé Césaire was a fantastic poet from the West Indies, French Martinique. He was also a great politician and an anti-colonialist thinker. And he founded a movement called La Négritude. And this word, so you have the quotation here, and he claims, I will translate as we know, négritude is the simple recognition of the fact of being black, the acceptation of this fact, of our fate as black men, of our history and our culture. Now, négritude is built on a word that is originally derogatory. The inversion of the stigmata is when you take the word which was thrown at you as an insult and you reclaim it and say, well, yes, that will be me, and you weaponize it against the one who insulted you. Interestingly enough, this is something that is very, very, very common in history. For instance, I don't know if you know that there is a movement of painters called the Fauve, the Wild Beast, and actually it was their opponents who first saying, these guys are painting like wild beasts. And the painters thought, oh, pretty cool, we will call ourselves wild beasts. So the inversion of the stigmata, very well known in the 20th century, actually already was already a move that was performed back in the 18th century. For instance, in the French Revolution, the revolutionaries called themselves sans-culottes, the ones who wore no breeches. Culottes meant a kind of breeches that you would wear over your trousers. And the nobility, they wore breeches. And it was the nobility who would mock the commoners by calling them les sans-culottes. And during the revolution, the revolutionaries are saying, yeah, that's us, we are the sans-culottes. And they're being proud of this. I'm mentioning this simply to show that the notion that they are referring to themselves as the impure blood is plausible. And now, if you think of the notion that they are referring to their blood, then the song, which intuitively we hear as a kind of a horrible, gruesome, massacre-inducing song, takes a completely different meaning. Because the idea is that the revolutionaries are going off to war, and at this time they are fighting all the nations gathered against them, allied against them, and they are very worried that they are going to lose. And they're saying, well, no matter, we will give our blood for freedom, and the blood that we give in defense of freedom will seep into the land, and freedom will grow from the land. And indeed, throughout the revolution, the symbolic gesture of the revolutionaries was the planting of freedom trees. This is what you see on your image, people planting a tree for freedom. So now we understand that the trees from freedom, the trees of freedom, the liberty trees, grow because they are watered by the blood of people who dare to die for freedom. And there is even here an interesting point of translation, because I translated qu'un sang impur abreuve nos sillons as may an impure blood water our fields. But I think in English, you say to water for an animal or for a plant, right? You water a cow and you water a tree. But in French, not so. In French, for a plant, we would say that we arroser the plant. But for an animal or for a sentient being, we abreuver the plant. And so in the notion of may an impure blood abreuver our fields, there is also a personification of the field. The field becomes a living thing, a thing that can have emotions and experience pleasure and pain. So this suggests a very, very intense relation to the land, and which is not surprising if you think that in the times of the French Revolution, 85% of the French people were peasants. Okay, so you see now we have, I hope, made plausible this complete reversal of the meaning of the song. Now, I'm not claiming that my interpretation is 100% certain, but one thing is for sure, it is consonant with the mindset of the revolutionaries, since their slogan, as you can see on this poster, was unity and indivisibility of the Republic. This meant that the Republic would no more be divided in nobility, clergy, and commoner. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, order. And this, the death mentioned here, of course, is their own death. We will live in freedom, equality, and fraternity, or we will die. Well, however, I have to say that there is evidence to suggest that the racist, gruesome, maybe not the racist, but the gruesome interpretation of the song is the right one. For instance, on 23rd July 1789, this was the day after some popular insurrection in the streets of Paris, and some people had been lynched. And so a guy, Antoine Barnave, declares at the rostrum of the National Assembly, "On veut nous attendrir, messieurs, en faveur du sang qui a été versé hier à Paris. Ce sang était-il donc si pur?" In English, they want to soften us, gentlemen, in favor of the blood that was spilled yesterday. Was that blood so pure? So here, clearly, Barnave, who is a revolutionary, actually he's a pretty tepid revolutionary, but anyway, he is this time clearly putting in doubt the purity of the revolutionary's opponents, right? So that could be normal. So it could be that the word impure was meant simply as a form of as a kind of moral judgment. If you have an impure blood, meant simply that you were a bad person. So then, if that's the case, then indeed the revolutionary song could mean let us spill the blood of all the bad people. However, we should not take Barnave's words as proof. For one thing, from the gallery, when Barnave made this comment, people, and these were revolutionary, they cried out, "Oh, what a tiger, what a beast, what a disgusting thing to say." So a lot of people who would sing La Marseillaise did not think that Barnave's words were accurate or did not agree with Barnave's words. Besides, even if Barnave, the way in which Barnave understands the notion of purity is the one that people had in mind when they sang the Marseillaise, note that it's already, at least, it's not racial anymore, but simply moral. So that already makes a difference. Now, maybe actually one thing to say would be that it's probably a fool's errand to even look for the correct interpretation of La Marseillaise, because even at the time, when people were marching in the thousands singing this song, how do we know that they all understood it the same way, that they all gave the words the same meaning? However, I like to find an evidence of the validity of my interpretation. I favor my interpretation, not so much because I have a proof that it is accurate, but just because it is the one that I like. But at least I'm not the only one to hold this interpretation. And it was also held by this young man that you see on your screen, a very famous, romantic, fascinating, charismatic poet, Arthur Rimbaud, here in his teens, for he was an actual prodigy and wrote just completely groundbreaking poetry even before he turned 20. And Arthur Rimbaud was a man of the people, and he was a dedicated Republican. And he lived after the revolution, way after the revolution, because you know that the French Revolution failed. So at some point, the revolutionaries were wiped away. So first they were wiped away by Napoleon, and then Napoleon himself was wiped away by the English. And then there were kings, and even another Napoleon who implemented a second empire. It's called. You don't need to remember all these details. The point is that when Rimbaud is born, the revolution is just a memory. It's a cherished memory of a glorious but eventually failed struggle. And it is also, when Rimbaud is young, it's also the time of France's colonial expansion. And now here is something very interesting for you to know. When France started increasing its colonial empire during the 19th century, it did so justifying colonialism in the name of the French Revolution. It said, we are the country of the rights of man. We are going to export these rights of man, which is an absolutely horrible perversion of the meaning of the revolution. They see that this is where suddenly the revolution starts being strangely compatible with racism. Now, Rimbaud is seeing all this happen and he doesn't like it. And this leads him to write this poem in tribute, in homage to the warriors of the revolution. So, very much struggle to translate it, and if we have time, but sadly I don't think we will have enough time, I would have loved to work on the translation with you. It's extraordinarily difficult. So let's read it in the English, and maybe in the chat you can tell me if it made sense or if it doesn't make sense. Dead. So this is dead man. In the French, mort de 92 et de 93. Mort can mean the dead people. I think in English it would be more natural to write dead men, but it makes the rhythm of the verse heavier. So I just said like this again. Dead of 92 and 93, who, pale with freedom's strong kiss, calmly under your wooden shoes, rock the yoke that waits upon the sword and forehead of all humankind. Men ecstatic and great in turmoil, you whose hearts leapt with love under the rag, all soldiers whom death hath sown, noble lover, to regenerate them in all the old furrows, you whose blood washed all soiled grandeur, dead of Valmy, dead of Fleury, dead of Italy, O million Christ with dark and gentle eyes, we let you sleep with the Republic, we, bent under kings as under a rod. Messieurs de Castagnac are mentioning you. So I will get to this final line in a minute. But what you see, I think, clearly here is that when he thinks of the dead of 92 and 93, obviously he's thinking in the terms of the Marseillaise. We have the furrows, we have the blood spilled, we have the regeneration, which is, of course, what you get when you bathe a land. And very clearly for Rimbaud, what is happening is that it is the martyrs of freedom that have given their blood for liberty to grow. So at least Rimbaud has understood La Marseillaise like I do. And now the last line, Messieurs de Castagnac are mentioning you, is pretty fascinating in its own right. So Messieurs de Castagnac were sort of a bourgeois colonialist politician, and they were among the people who were saying, we have to colonize foreign lands because this would be a way for us to continue the revolutionary mission. And this infuriated Rimbaud. So the last line reads as sarcastic and ironic. We let you martyrs sleep with the Republic, and who dares call your name? Well, such corrupted beings as Monsieur de Castagnac. So there is something very striking in this poem with its final twist. Okay, so if you want, actually, I realized that I've been pretty fast, so I'm quite ahead of the time I thought I would take for this lecture. So maybe actually we can at some point open the mic or the floor and have let me let you say how you would what you think of this poem, or maybe where you think my translation is faulty. Okay, so that was my lecture, and you see the point of the lecture was to say, number one, that the historicization of a document is very important because it's extremely easy to jump to a mistaken interpretation of something like a Marseillaise if we don't contextualize it. Number two, that even when a document is contextualized, well, it still doesn't mean that its meaning can be settled once and for all. Perhaps its meaning was even unstable at the point of origin. Number three, that in times of indeterminacy, when the meaning cannot be fixed, actually, secretly or overtly, we tend to choose the meaning we prefer. And now maybe the best way to argue in favor of our preferred explanation is to tease out its beauty, to show all that it brings to the table. And this is where poetry helps. And I think when I read Rimbaud's poem, it serves as a validation of the interpretation, because it shows that this interpretation yields great beauty and depth. All right. And so this is, I think, the kind of things that you would and in practice if you were at Cambridge. And since I have a few minutes more, we will keep going in this history of the Marseillaise by stressing that I said that the French Revolution justified colonialism, that the French Republic justified colonialism in the name of the French Revolution. And this led to a fascinating paradox, because in the French colonial empire, there were French schools. And a tiny, tiny minority of colonized people went to these schools, mainly because every empire needs to sort of bring people in to act as cogwheels in the chain of command, if you like. That means that there was a tiny minority of colonized people who learned the French Revolution. And obviously, they were struck by the contradiction between the content of the revolution and the fact of colonialism. This is why a great number of anti-colonial French thinkers were all great scholars of the French Revolution. Élie Césaire, whom we saw earlier, wrote a book on the French Revolution. Frantz Fanon, the great Martinican rebel, was a great scholar of the French Revolution. Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese rebel, is similarly, and so on and so forth. So you see that even way further, way down the line, much later after an event, the meaning of an event can still be contested, and it will be contested depending on the political situation of the day. In 1991, the Chinese prime minister was asked what he thought of the consequences of the French Revolution, and he said, "It's too soon to tell." This will be the last word of this lecture. And now, as I have a little time still, I will return to the course and tell you a little bit how the course is structured. I thought it was more interesting to hopefully tell you something fun, which should make you interested in the course and now perhaps more eager to listen to how the course is structured. So this is how it works. The course lasts 4 years. And normally a Cambridge undergraduate course is 3 years, but with MML or HML or modern languages and linguistics, you have a third year that you spend abroad, so that your final year is pushed back by 1 year. So the year abroad, obviously, is a very good reason in itself to apply for MML, because it's a wonderful, wonderful time, a wonderful adventure. And when you go abroad, you can either do so through schemes that are very much like a preset and well organized. So you can work for the British Council, or you can study in a foreign university. So you're completely certain that you will find something to do. But there is also a great space for creativity, because you can come up with your own ideas. You can do an internship. You can all kinds of things. Of course, these would have to be agreed. But as long as we're sure that whatever you do will require that you speak the language, it won't happen. So the year abroad is fun. The year abroad is also very important, because students apply to Cambridge from all kinds of different situations, and they are not all at the same level in the languages that they study when they enter. So sometimes new students, freshers, can feel very insecure. Oh my gosh, is my French good enough? Is my Spanish good enough? But actually, you only need to hang in there, because the year abroad is the great leveler. And when people come back from the year abroad, everybody's good. Okay, so that's for the broad structure of the course. Now, so if you study, let's say MML, you study 2 languages. Now, all that I'm going to say, so I'm going to now tell you how you would study 1 language. And of course, the same thing happens for the second language. And if you were doing HML so HML is modern languages and history. So if you were doing modern languages and history or modern languages and linguistics, you would have a half a typos, and that would still work exactly the way I'm going to describe. Okay, so when you study your language, you have language classes. So as I said, conversation, oral, grammar, and so on, and then literature classes. And Cambridge, and I think as well Oxford, they have a particularity, which is that the literature side takes place in English. If I was teaching you, I would teach you in English, and you would write your essays in English. You read the text in the original, you quote the text in the original, but you write your essays in English and you're taught in English. Personally, I think this is a wonderful, wonderful thing, because if we were to teach in French from the beginning, then obviously we would have to adjust the intellectual content of the course to your linguistic competencies, and that would make it less interesting. So what happens is that little by little, your language level catches up with the intellectual demands that are from the literary, philosophy, history side, if you like. And in the final year, normally, you're capable of doing everything in your target language. All right. What else could I tell you? So another great thing about the course is the great variety of choices that you have. So in your first year, you will have, in the first year, pretty much everything is set. You take like the language papers that you're supposed to and the literature paper that you're supposed to. But already in the second year, you can choose what you want to study. So the first year literature paper is a kind of overview where you have text from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, to just the whole historical spectrum all the way to the 21st century. And then in your second year, you decide, okay, I would rather focus on medieval stuff or on early modern stuff. So that's like the Renaissance to the French Revolution, or like a 19th century or post-colonial things. And then you see it's your choice where you want to specialize. Then when you go abroad, you have to write something, the Your Abroad project, it's called. And this is wonderful because you can do anything. Anything. Of course, it has to be of a high standard, but you can do anything. Once I had a student who spent a year in the French town of Toulouse, And when he arrived in Toulouse, he was stunned by the quality of the graffiti. And it turns out that indeed Toulouse has a very long tradition of graffiti. And so he wrote his Year Abroad project on graffiti culture in Toulouse. You know, this is an example, but there is great freedom during the Year Abroad project. And in the final year, you can choose even more precisely what you want to study. So it may be like one author or one theme, and then it becomes very, very personal. And this is actually a great preparation for an eventual master's if you decide to do a master's, because you see you're becoming ever more capable of circumscribing your topic and designing what you want to do. And so you're being ready to be a master's student. So one thing I should maybe have mentioned also is that you can study a language at Cambridge after having studied it at A levels, or having not studied it at all. If you have never studied a language, you will be what is called an ab initio student. But that's all fine. You know, it's all everything is set to bring you gradually up to speed. And in your second year already, you'll be mixed with past A level students and be perfectly capable of coping. All right. What else have I not mentioned? I think I think I covered almost all the ground. So you know, of course, that you have supervisions and lectures. Alex, I think you mentioned this. That's also a very great thing, because the very small number of students per supervisions mean that there is very a possibility for the teachers to address your needs with great precision. So right now, we're nearing the exams, and I'm seeing my students one-on-one almost all the time. They're discussing their favorite books or addressing a very special concern that they might have with an idea that they can't wrap their heads around. So this is a really great thing. Oh yes, and one last thing I thought I should mention is that so Alex said that Cambridge had a very high employability rate, so meaning that you get jobs after you study. And one thing that is very interesting about MML is that it enables students to branch out to a great number of things. So after having done modern and medieval languages, you can of course do a master's in, I don't know, French literature, German cinema, or whatever, like whatever. You know? But a lot of students also take say a law conversion course, or move to business or to political sciences. And this is a sign of the variety of the course. Because, for instance, if I have a student that wants to study political sciences, I can write a reference letter saying, well, this student has acquired a great knowledge of the French Revolution and the rise of communism in the 19th century. Thanks to their degree in modern languages, they can study text in original sources in 3 different texts, say English, Spanish, and French. So, you know, there are many ways in which you can valorize, like you have taught at MML to make yourself very good candidates to a great variety of master programs. So that's also, I think, a very good sign, or a very good point of these syllabuses. Now, just to conclude, a few words on history and linguistics. So when you have these joint purposes, modern languages and history, modern languages and linguistics, actually they're completely separate things. So you're doing half of your work belongs to MML, and the other half belongs to the history faculty, linguistics faculty. So it's different people, different exams. But of course, you will notice that what you learn in history naturally enriches when you think about the literature, and also what you learn in literature. You know, it's like you have different source material that you can use for the history. So there is a lot of synchronicity between the parts of the triples, but it's really in your head. Like administratively, the two things are quite distinct. Okay, so I think I told you everything I meant to say. And Alex, what do you want? How do you want that we proceed now? Do you want? Shall we open? Shall we start the Q&A or?
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, there is a Q&A function that's built into Zoom. Please do type your questions into there, and we can answer them live as fast as possible. I've got a question for you that might be interesting for students. How does the exam structure and the work structure look like? What does it look like as a ML student?
The exam structure, is that what you said?
The exam structure and the regular structure in terms of, say, essays that you're due in a week, How does that
Very
work
good.
throughout the year?
Yeah. I should have mentioned this already. All right. So uh, throughout the year, what you have is you have for each of your papers, you have weekly or fortnightly supervision. And so, if let's say I would be teaching you the French literature paper, I would see you every week. 1 week we would discuss a text and a question about this text, and the week after you have to write an essay on that text. So that means that you have fortnightly assignments. Since you tend to have fortnightly assignments for all your papers, and you have 3 papers per language, and therefore 6 papers in total. So you have 3 papers a week to write. If you did the math, you have 6 papers fortnightly, so 3 weekly. It's intense. It's doable. Students tend to survive. And the secret of Cambridge is to come well prepared because terms are short and dense. So you have to arrive having written your text in advance, not written, of course, but read your text in advance and so on. As for the exams, so it's a mix. Some exams are taken online, and you have, say, the exam question will be released, and you have 5 hours, and then you have to submit your paper. And this is something that really became more usual during COVID, of course, because we couldn't have exams in person. The more time passes, the more we're returning to in-person exams. So that means that you have, for instance, 3 hours to write 3 essays on French literature. It's pretty intense as well, but practice makes perfect, and this is something, of course, that we prepare students to throughout the year. So it's a fascinating thing to see how in week one student will work 4 hours, 4 days, like a dog, to write an essay, and at the end of the year, in an hour, they produce something much higher quality. So it's part of the learning curve. I hope that answers the question. I see many questions on the Q&A. So let's go. How does the course differ for a student studying a language at the beginner level compared to one studying at a more advanced level? This is Melody's question. So the first year is very different because in the first year, of course, if you start a language at the beginner's level, then you spend much more time on the language, and the literature is introduced really gradually, and you pick up speed. You pick up speed as time goes. So that's really the main difference, that the balance between language and literature, which is normally 50-50, or which is 50-50 when you study post A level, is actually, say, 75-25 when you study a language at the beginner's level, and little by little things get to the same point. To what extent is there a choice of subjects in joint honors, joint schools, degrees? Well, this is to the same extent as if you're doing a single honors, say, like just MML. So you have in history, you have a very broad palette of papers to choose from, as in MML. So I think in every configuration you get a lot of choice. How do the proportion of historical political context compare to the language or literature content within a Cambridge MML course? I'm not sure I understand the question. So how do the proportions of historical political context compare? Sorry. Okay. I see. I understand. So this is really up to you in more ways than one. So when you choose your papers, you can choose papers that are more intrinsically political than others. So you might have a paper that would be poetics in the 21st century, and that would not be necessarily very political. It will be more stylistic. You will have another paper that is decolonial thinking in the Spanish-speaking world, for instance, and that will be very political. So it depends on which paper you choose. But then also, even when you study a text, any kind of text, there are many ways in which you can study a text. You can take, the number of approaches are endless. To bombard you with terms that you may have never heard, like semiology, structuralism, whatnot, and also political studies. So you can also decide to approach a text from a more political angle, So yeah, do you have any recommendations for strong French MFL super curricular? So I imagine that means, what could you read, like, besides what you're currently reading in high school, if I understand that well? Wow. The recommendations would be infinite. Oh my gosh! So I could just tell you what are my favorite books. Let me try to think of something. I will put it in the chat. So there is Annie Ernaux. Annie Ernaux got the Nobel Literature Prize a few years back, and she's a fabulous writer, both as a writer and also as a feminist, and someone who, and also as someone who is from a working class and is trying to not forget this as she writes now as a superstar. So that's a very, very good book, Annie Ernaux. And then what else could I suggest for you? Um, well, Emily Césaire, who I just whose face I just showed, the inventor of Negritude. He has Discours sur le colonialisme. That's an absolute bombshell of a text, and if you, I promise you that if you pick it up, you will never ever forget it. And maybe could we think of one last one? Could read. Oh, I know. If it was me, now I love Annie Ernaux, but to be completely honest with you, if it was me, she would not have had the Nobel Prize because it would have gone to Maryse Condé. Maryse Condé is a Martinican writer. She has many gorgeous books, but Segu is a big book. It's two big fat volumes, but absolute page turners. I promise you. I will tell you just between us that it's been translated in English by Penguin. And obviously, you've grabbed it before the summer. You will not let it go of it. You will not let go of it throughout the summer. Okay, that would be enough for my extracurricular recommendations. And then Dara is asking: does the MMO course prepare you to speak the language in everyday life, or is the focus more academic? Well, both really. So, as I said, the history, literature side and the language side are kept in a sense separated. So, since now I do teach language, but for a long time I only taught literature and I never spoke French with my students. But of course, they spoke French with other people, and students tend to organize among themselves, like talking societies and so on and so forth. So of course, the idea is that you do learn to speak a language in everyday life. And of course, as I mentioned before, it's a great moment when you are in full immersion.